We say, well, at some random point, i.e. when one of our primary stakeholders dies, whoop, it's all going to go to you all at once. Or we could say, hey, let's give ourselves a time horizon here, and let's gradually start transferring pieces and management and decision-making over. And when we do that, it's a lot more deliberate. It's a lot more thoughtful. We have the opportunity to say, hey, is this working, or do we need to tweak something? And it gives us a much greater chance for success.
We're talking about generational succession of farms this week on the AgNow Roundup. Well, howdy. Welcome to the AgNow Roundup. My name is Dave Deacon. So what happens to the farm when we die? That's a question that we all have, but not a lot of producers are willing to take the time to find the answer to. And that's why we're talking with Oklahoma State University's Professor of Agricultural Law, Dr. Shannon Ferrell, today on the program. He'll be talking with us about planning for the succession from one generation to the next. We'll be talking with Dr. Ferrell in just a couple of minutes, but first, let's take a look at the weather across the ag world with meteorologist Matt Makins.
Time for AgNow weather. Matt Makins here. Let's do a quick breakdown of some of the hazards coming our way for the next week to 2 weeks. So we're going to be watching out for winds across the Four Corners region. This is also a very dry area, as we'll hit on in this video, and this will lead to some heightened fire dangers for any sort of ignition sources that do occur. Excessive heat down across the south. We'll have more on the record temperatures in a moment. Very heavy rainfall across the Gulf Coast states, and then we have some isolated flooding here to the north. That's a combination of incoming rain plus snow melt. And lots of rain have been falling there across the Midwest, leading to some flooding with any additional rainfall that's on the way. So that's a quick recap of some of the hazards. Probably most notable will be the risks of severe weather across the eastern U.S., but for the next couple of days it's going to be focused on the southeast where that heavy rainfall is. You can always get these maps. I shouldn't say always because I might be running late, but on Twitter, Matt Makins on Twitter, and you can see these maps. I'll post them every morning for a severe weather outlook, or you can go to SPC's website, great outlook section there, and gives you a early heads up of any severe weather that may be coming your way. Let's check on our soils and soil health. Temperatures are coming up pretty quickly. We have a little pocket here in North Dakota with some of the soils that are still a little sluggish to be warming up, but we're closing in on those deadlines as we get everything planted. I know there's some delays around Iowa and things just from recent wet weather, so perhaps you're one of those hoping for some drier days, although it's been nice to have that water. Here's the current soil moisture. Iowa is still very dry in terms of that soil moisture. So is southern Colorado down through New Mexico into West Texas, the panhandle there. Also some sections here hit and miss out across the east and the south where we could use some water to boost the soil moistures. Quite a healthy swath of soil here from Montana down into northern Nebraska. Compare this to earlier this year, about 4 months ago, early January or so. Very dry for the Four Corners, very dry for the West and the Pacific Northwest, extremely dry around Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri down across the Delta country here. But watch as we've changed things. So this is the change comparing the first soil map to that last one. So the soil moisture change in the last 4 months. All the improved areas, that's percentage gain in soil moisture. Those are the blue shades, and that covers a lot of corn country, a lot of cotton country, a lot of grass country, a lot of hay country. We have some pockets here in the Dakotas and Minnesota that could use some work, close to the foothills in southern Kansas down into the panhandle of Texas. We need some water here. That area has actually been drying out relative to about 4 months ago. Let's check the timeline and see when the storms are going to be firing up, and if you can hope for moisture this week, or if you don't want that moisture, you can hope for your dry pockets. As this animation gets going, watch right in here, the southern areas over the weekend and early next week. You'll see that shield of rain, those thunderstorms growing in intensity and coverage. There may be severe weather, damaging thunderstorms there. Once we clear that system out, middle parts of next week, we'll be watching the northern plains and parts of Canada as the system sinks lower, comes into the central states, and again produces very heavy rainfall and potentially some damaging thunderstorms as well. So this timeline is really focusing on the northern plains at times, the southern plains at times, and almost throughout the eastern third of the U.S. Let's check at the total water that's going to be coming through with this moisture. You're going to see a notable swath of heavy precip totals from Dallas and Houston stretching out toward the Atlantic Ocean. Also into parts of Colorado, some heavy water is on the way. And that's going to be a combination of rain and snow, but mostly in terms of rain this time as we're pretty warm. As you work northward into the Corn Belt in the Midwest and the upper Midwest, remember that area of dry soils, or gotten drier anyway. Here in the Dakotas and Minnesota, you have some water coming your way, but it's going to amount to anywhere from a quarter to a half inch in most cases. Once you head down to the south, and we'll fly that map view in from Dallas, close to Houston and north of toward Shreveport, kind of these orange shades into the yellows, that's 4 inches at least. A lot of water. Speaking of a lot of water, in portions of Tennessee, just over the past week, they have 6-7 isolated 8-inch totals, so really heavy rainfall here. Let's turn to snowfall. Again, kind of limited. Colorado Rockies have a little bit, so too will have Wyoming, but for the next week or so, the snow map is pretty blank, and it's heading in that direction obviously as we get later into May and warm things up. Back to the hazards, and speaking of warming things up, remember this area of high heat down across the south? Let's take a look at the records that are going to be possible throughout the week ahead. It's not unusual to have triple digits, but it's unusual for, say, Laredo in parts of South Texas to be hitting 106s, 7s, 8s, 109s, and that's the kind of heat that's going to be headed in for parts of the week ahead. And then throughout Florida, we have a lot of mid and upper 90s. I know we've got some cattle country here, horse country as well. Throughout Florida, you're going to watch as your conditions really dry out rapidly with that heat, and the same for South Texas. Weekly outlooks. Speaking of weeks, let's go with the weekly outlooks here. And we kind of focused on this first week, the 9th through the 16th, where we have a lot of water for the Gulf Coast states and a little bit in Colorado, drier elsewhere. Let's go to the following week, 16th of May through the 23rd, and we're still focusing on the Gulf Coast states and parts of Colorado. Beyond, we have hit and miss moisture mostly on the high plains here, a little bit drier in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And then the last week here, this is the 30th of May through the first week of June, and we have some pockets of water here, mostly focusing on Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, parts of the Osage country, and back into parts of the eastern Corn Belt. Temperatures during that same span, well, coolest now with all the water that's inundating the south and the southeast, so cooler than normal there. Moderating for next week will bring the temperatures back closer to average in a lot of cases, cool it back down to wrap up May and start off June cooler than average across the south. That's due to the frequency of the storm flow and some of the soil moistures that have been so soggy recently, keeping temperatures a bit cooler than average. That's this week's AgNow Weather Report. We'll see you next time.
Well, thank you so much, Matt. It was Benjamin Franklin that said that there are only two things certain in life, and it's death and taxes. And that's why we're talking about generational succession of the farm with Dr. Shannon Ferrell, who is an ag professor at Oklahoma State University. Dr. Ferrell, thanks for going on with us. And why is it so important for families to have a plan for what happens to the farm after a family member passes?
You know, we live in a very asset-intensive business. If you look at the USDA ARMS data, on average, and I mean on average, a U.S. farm and ranch has about $1.2 million of assets. So you would think in such an asset-intensive business that we would be very mindful of retaining the integrity of that asset base as we move from one generation to the next. But if you look at certain metrics, the ballpark figure is probably about 30%, give or take a little bit, of U.S. farms and ranches successfully make their generational transfer from one generation to the next while keeping that asset base intact. So, you know, we're talking about better than 2/3 of our farms and ranches facing some form of split as they move from one generation to the next. And if you ask farmers and ranchers, well, what do I want to have happen to my farm and ranch as it passes to the next generation? You know, almost universally, they're going to say, well, I want to give my family the opportunity to keep farming and I want to keep the farm together for them. And what we see is that if you don't do something about that, if you're passive rather than active and you don't have a good plan, you're basically asking for your farm to be broken up. So there are lots of other reasons why we would tell any other good, responsible adult, hey, you need an estate plan for dozens of reasons. But you take all of those reasons and then add on top of that the fact that in agriculture, this isn't just a set of personal assets, it's also the economic engine for the enterprise that supports the family. So it's even more important for us to be really proactive on that front.
And one of the things that I know I've dealt with in my family, folks don't necessarily think of the farm as a business. They think of it as, oh, that's my aunt and uncle's place. They happen to grow, wheat. Why is it so important to make that conscious decision that this is a business? We need to look at it as such, so that way we can transfer it from one person to the other.
I think for whatever reason in agriculture, sometimes we make business a dirty word. Like, no, we're not in business. We farm. Like, well, that's business, right? Anything that your family economically depends on needs to take on heightened importance. And so I think not thinking of our farm and ranch operations as an agribusiness kind of does us a disservice, because when we view it that way, we might be looking at it exactly like you said. We look at this asset or this asset or this asset, and we don't think about it in the context of how all those assets work together to form the resources that our business needs to operate. And so by the same token, having those collections of assets together that may have been accumulated over multiple generations, right? This isn't just that we acquired this all at once. This was built for many farm families over generations and generations. And it would be really hard to replicate that all in one generation, which is a point we'll get to maybe here in just a little bit. But all that to say, when you recognize that, hey, I'm not just transferring a collection of assets, it's a collection of assets that have a function within a business, and I need to look at not only transferring the assets, but transferring the business. Well, then we kind of shift from just an estate planning mode, even if we were doing that in the first place, to a business transition mode. And so when we think about both of those things together, now we've got a real chance to think about it holistically and strategically and really give that next generation their best chance of success by keeping all of those elements together and economically functional.
What kind of timeline should someone be realistically be looking at whenever they are planning on taking the farm from one generation to the next?
I think one of the reasons that we face so much stress and what I'd probably call a fairly low success rate in our farm transitions is that people look at it as solely an estate planning exercise.
Right.
When I die, here's who I want to receive this asset. And that's all that they think about. But that really does us a disservice because, number one, that date is unknown and unknowable. So I have no idea when one of my primary stakeholders is going to pass away. I know it's going to happen eventually, but I have no idea when it's going to happen. And as a result of that, we're basing our business transition on a random event. And that's just not good for business, right? We would love for this to be an organized, thoughtful and gradual transition over time. And the analogy that I use with folks a lot is if I had a priceless asset, let's say I've got a $1 million Ming vase, okay? Incredibly valuable, but also kind of delicate. I got to take care of it. Now, if I want to hand it to you, I've got two options. Either I could say, hey, I'm about to hand it to you. Then I say, make sure, are your hands on it? Do you feel comfortable with it? You've got a hold of it? Okay, I'm going to let go now, right? Or just some random interval, I can fling it at your head and hope that you catch it. And that's kind of what we do with our farms and ranches. We say, well, at some random point, i.e. when one of our primary stakeholders dies, whoop, it's all going to go to you all at once. Or we could say, hey, let's give ourselves a time horizon here and let's gradually start transferring pieces and management and decision-making over. And when we do that, it's a lot more deliberate. It's a lot more thoughtful. We have the opportunity to say, hey, is this working or do we need to tweak something? And it gives us a much greater chance for success. So as far as timelines go, I always tell everyone the best time for you to have your transition plan in place was yesterday, but the second best time is let's start today. We don't have to have the whole shoot and match in place all at once, but let's start planning and thinking about it, because the more time we have, the more options we have available to us and the more margin for error we have. If we find out that we're doing something and it's not working, okay, we've got time to fix it before it really has to lock into place.
Whenever it comes time to make that first step, is it sit down with a lawyer? Is it sit down with the families ahead of time and just kind of jot out a plan? Is it just this is what I'm a verbal agreement? What's the best first step?
So I always break down the transition planning process into basically 5 steps. And that first step is simply inventory. I mean, if you want to wrap it in one word, it's inventory. So before you go talk to your accountant, to your attorney, which, by the way, at some point in the process, you definitely need to do. But before you do any of that, I just want you to do the deepest dive inventory on your farm and ranch operation that you have ever done. I want you to round up every deed to every piece of property you own. If you lease land, I want you to round up every lease agreement. I want you to know the serial number, that have the title documents for any vehicles or pieces of equipment. I want you to have inventories of all your commodities, of all of your inputs. I want you to round up all of your investments, all of your insurance policies of any form whatsoever. I want you to tally up everybody who has a connection to your farm, whether that's economic or emotional. If you have a cousin that always used to come spend summers on the farm with your grandpa or grandma, inventory everybody, right? The reason I'm telling you to do that as your first step is we're going to try to put together a puzzle, and we need to have all the pieces laid out in front of us. That's going to be necessary for any of our professionals, like our accountant or an attorney, because they're going to need to see all those pieces to see how they work and how your transactions are going to move forward. But perhaps even more importantly than that, the process of you getting that inventory together gets your gears turning. You start thinking about the roles that all of those pieces play in your farm and ranch, and you start thinking about, well, how could that role change moving forward? So it's a hugely important piece for you. It's a hugely important piece for your professionals, but it's also just really importantly a thought exercise to get you thinking deeply about what you want the future of your operation to look like. So always start with inventory, and then we can move forward from there.
So that's a great point. My grandpa always said, get an attorney in the beginning or the end. Either way, you're going to need one, and it's important, like you say, to have that in the first step. What would be the next step?
So once we've laid all these pieces out, then I always say that the next step is communicate. And I have a pretty great success rate getting farmers and ranchers excited and engaged with that step one. And then when we talk about step two and communicate, that's when everyone winds up in the ditch. Because farmers and ranchers are great and brave and courageous and smart, and they might have one blind spot, and that might be communicating about their emotions to any other human being at all. And that's what you got to do in step two, because you need to engage with everyone who's a stakeholder in your operation. So let's talk about stakeholders for just 1 second. I define stakeholders in this process as everyone that has some sort of an economic connection. So do they depend on the farm in some way for some part of their economic livelihood? But two, do they have an emotional connection? Are they a spouse of someone that's connected to the farm, or some other relative? Or like I said, have they had some prior connection to the farm and ranch? Do they spend time there? Is that where they celebrated family Christmases? Is that where they went hunting or fishing or had other recreational use with grandma and grandpa or their family members? Because at some point in this process, I want to touch base with all of them. If someone's actively engaged in the farm, or if they're a close family member, I want to ask them, hey, what do you view as the future of this farm? And what do you view your role in that future being? And I'm not, denying, the owners of this farm and ranch, their agency, right? They have the ultimate decision-making control about how that changes moving forward, but they want to make that decision with the best available information. And sometimes no one ever thinks to ask the question. So ask, right? So that communication is important, in that I have to engage everyone at some point in time, not just so I get the best information, but also so those people feel like they've been heard. We can point to study after study after study that shows if there's a deliberative strategic process like we're talking about here, and people felt like they were respected and that they had a fair chance to be heard, they are massively more likely to accept the outcome of that process, even if it's not the outcome they were advocating for. And so especially when we're talking about estate planning issues, I want people to feel like they are comfortable with that outcome and the process, and I don't want them fighting it. We can save ourselves a lot if we engage with those people. But the other element of that communication process is simply, let's find out if there's any elephants in the room. If there's any sort of a family conflict that's blocking us from moving ahead, let's identify it and get it out there. Because if we don't do that, no matter what we do, we're not going to have success, because we've got to take care of the elephant in the room. So that's why that communication step in the process is so important. It's not only strategic, but it's got tremendous emotional value too.
The thing I like about what you mentioned in that step is talking to the cousins, because they are maybe not the people that are directly associated with the land, but they do have that the memories, and it's extending that branch of goodwill to them, and that's really important.
I'll give you a very quick example, a very short example about that. We were helping one farm family, and one branch of the family just seemed very resistant to anything that we were talking about. And so I got them one-on-one, and I said, "Hey, tell me what's bothering you here?" And they said, "Well, we always went deer hunting with Grandpa on the land that you're talking about, maybe being sold off or made part of this other branch of the operation, and we're really worried we'll never get to go hunting there again." And so I asked them, well, if you had an assurance that you'd have a recreational easement, so you could always go hunting and fishing on that property as long as it wasn't disruptive to the ag operations, would that make you feel more comfortable? They said, yeah, that's all we really wanted. I mean, it was something that cost really nothing to the farm operation, but it acknowledged that emotional connection, and that's what made things possible.
Just that one little comment in the whole page of plans moving forward, it set everybody at ease on that. That's great.
Absolutely.
What would be the next step after communication? Okay,
so we've inventoried, we've communicated. Now we need to talk about how does the business move forward.
Right.
And so, like we talked about earlier, lots of people get very focused on the estate planning, and estate planning is actually a critical piece of this. But perhaps maybe equally or even more importantly is how does the business move forward? And so here's where we run into the real, I think, meat of the challenge in farm transition planning. And to an extent, this is different for agriculture, but I would also say that if you have any small, family held business, a lot of these challenges are there for you too, because in contrast, if it was just a private person, right, they'd worked for someone else, they've been an employee, not an employer, and they have a 401k and a life insurance policy and some other assets, well, then it's very easy, relatively speaking, to say, okay, I'm just dividing this in equal numbers amongst my heirs because, those investments divide pretty easily, right? No one notices if a 401k gets broken up. But it's very different in agriculture and those other small family-held businesses because we're talking about a collection of assets that are essential to the business. If we divide those up evenly, the business might fail or just not have enough assets to be viable, or it might have to incur an incredible amount of debt to try to reaccumulate those assets in some way. So we get into a lot of challenges there. And so what we really have to do in step 3 is talk about, like I said, that business transition. That has to be closely coupled with our estate planning, especially in agriculture, because in agriculture, on average, 86% of our asset value is tied up in land, which is really tough to divide. It's very illiquid, and it's also really important to agriculture. So if that's where the bulk of our assets lie, and we really can't divide it up very well, we'll talk about undivided interest here in just a second, then we have to think more creatively about that. At the same time, we may be trying to deal with the fact that we have one or more heirs that don't want to come back and be actively engaged in the farm, or we may have no heirs that want to come back and be actively engaged in the farm. So this is really a business strategic planning process to say, hey, who wants to come back? What roles can they fulfill? What can we do while the senior generation, grandma and grandpa, mom and dad, are still alive, to start beginning that asset transfer, to begin training that next generation of management and help them kind of gradually move into that versus having it happen all at once. And that might involve the fact that we're not giving away everything. We might offer, a discounted sale to people that want to be involved in the farm moving forward. They get a better deal than going out to the open market, but mom and dad also get to cash out some of the equity value that they've built in those assets. Lots of ways of coming at that, but basically, like I said, this is a strategic planning process to make sure that when we do get to the estate planning piece, we have the business in a position where it can gradually move and feel like it's in a good place to take over once we have finally transferred that ownership, whether that's while we're alive or after someone's passed away, in a way that makes sure it's in good hands that we're handing it to, and that people are comfortable letting it go a little bit too.
It's great that you mentioned that, because I've have folks in my life who have transitioned their businesses from their parents to them, and they didn't necessarily think ahead of time for that, 10, 15 years ahead of time, kind of saying, okay, we're going to start putting this person in a leadership role and kind of teach them. They just kind of said, well, I think I'm going to retire next week. Here's the business if you want it. And it was pretty painful for both sides, and even the customers. There was confusion and all of that too. So that I'm glad you mentioned that as well.
Well, and when we talk about this with our farm families, we always say, hey, no Fortune 500 company would do it this way, right? No Fortune 500 company says, well, hey, here's the business is transferred this week, so congratulations, everybody. They have very deliberate plans going years out. And Dave, you made a fantastic point that wasn't just jarring for the family, but it was jarring for customers. You can't just swap people in and out of human relationships. It just doesn't work that way. So one of the reasons I always encourage, the senior generation to start working with their families to make this transition gradual is because let's get that next generation acclimated to the relationships that they'll need to be a part of. Whether that's, your lender, your vendors, your customers, but all the people that, have relationships that are required by your farm to operate. Let's get those folks warmed up to those relationships and help them establish relationships on their own, because you can't inherit relationships. Those have to be built independently.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for that one. What would be the next the step?
All right, step 4, that estate planning thing. Right.
Yes.
Lots of people really zero in on this, but I make it step 4 in our process because I want you to do those other steps to help you see how those steps then connect with your estate plan. Your estate plan doesn't need to take place in a vacuum. It needs to be integrated to your business transition plan after you've had those good conversations and after you know what all those other pieces are. So that's why we kind of make it step 4. But so now we need to talk about the fact that, all right, we may have transitioned some assets while we were alive, but we're still going to own some stuff when we die, unless you fulfilled that old proverb that your last check ought to bounce, which is fantastic if you know when your last check is going to be.
Right.
But since we generally don't know that, you probably need to plan a little bit more in advance for that. And so we want to do all that other work in advance so that we know how our estate plan needs to connect to that. But then our estate plan is absolutely critical because, again, if you don't have an estate plan, then your property is going to be transferred according to what we call intestate succession statutes, which is a really fancy legal word, but basically those are just the default rules. Those are the rules that the law will use to allocate your stuff if you didn't say how to allocate your stuff in a trust, a will, or in some other form of document. So I always tell people, and we'll go through this list really quickly, there are certain documents that everybody needs to have. And people say, well, Ferrell, what about this? No. Everybody. Okay. I want to be very clear about that. Everybody. 1, if you have kids under the age of 18, nominate a guardian for them, either in an independent document or as part of your will. So who gets custody of your kids if both of their parents pass away before age 18? Talk to the people in that document. Don't just throw kids at them unexpectedly. Let them give you a chance to say no if they want to. But also in your estate planning document, send some resources along with the children for their care and education if it's all possible. 2, if you have any sort of an investment like a 401k through work or an IRA or any kind of stocks or bank accounts, CDs, anything like that, life insurance policies, you probably have the opportunity to designate beneficiaries on those. Take advantage of those opportunities. Those are very inexpensive and very effective estate planning tools. They don't have to go through the probate process. So make sure you take care of those and make sure you check up on those every once in a while to make sure your beneficiaries are who you want them to be. Then everyone needs to have a durable power of attorney for health care and for business affairs. So if you become incapacitated, not if you've passed away, but if you become incapacitated because of an illness or some other condition, people can take care of your stuff. You need to have an advance directive. So what do you want in terms of end of life care if you come to a terminal condition or something like that? Then you need to make sure that you have some sort of plan for long-term care. Statistically speaking, most of us, well over 50%, and the number is more like 60, will need some form of long-term care sometime in our life, and that can get pretty expensive. So especially in agriculture where we have to be pretty asset protective, think about where the liquidity would come from if you had to pay for long-term care. And if long-term care insurance is affordable for you, okay, that's something to think about. Then Everybody needs to have a will. Even if you've got a trust and your trust is pretty awesome, that's fantastic. You still need to have a will just in case you didn't put anything into your trust. If you forgot that you acquired this piece of property and you didn't get it transferred into the trust, well, your will can go grab that and put it into the trust after you've passed away. And then does everybody need a trust? Maybe not. In agriculture, we're very asset intensive. Lots of times we want to try to keep our assets together, maybe for some period of time after we've passed away. And a will doesn't do that, right? A will transfers property and goes away. So if you have a lot of stuff that you want to give some pretty complex management instructions toward, and you want to hold it for a longer period of time, okay, that kind of starts pointing you towards a trust as maybe one of the tools that you want to use. Does everybody need life insurance? Maybe not. But especially if you're a young producer, I want you to think really hard about some term life insurance so that if something happens to you, you've got a pretty decent chunk of wealth that can be used to support your family and or pay off any debts so they don't have those burdens hanging over them while they're also dealing with the loss of a loved one. And if you're a more seasoned or producer that's had more birthdays, and you're dealing with the farm kid, city kid problem, right? I want to give assets to the farm kid, but I don't want to effectively disinherit city kid. Well, then life insurance proceeds might be some way of at least getting the scales a little bit more in balance in terms of dollar value, if you want to think about that. And then we kind of mentioned it already, but maybe you have enough liquidity, you don't need long-term care insurance, but at least think about long-term care insurance if you have the ability to make that affordable versus having to liquidate farm assets for that. So that's kind of the basic set of documents I want everybody to have as part of their estate planning process.
Well, and one thing I'm glad that you kind of clarified for folks who may have a little bit of vagueness in that the difference between a trust and a will, because you always hear, oh, it's in my will. Well, what I took you to say was the will is a one-time, this goes here, this needs to be done, bam, it's done. But the trust can be set up for a more long-term document to kind of ensure that things are going the way that you were intending them to.
Yeah, and if you want to explore that for just a minute, maybe the easiest way of thinking of a will is a set of instructions for distributing property when someone passes away, period. So it's, I want this asset to go here, this asset to go here, this asset to go here, and that's it. That's what the probate process does. It basically legally empowers that document and empowers the person that we've named as our executor to make those transfers of property. A trust, and this is not legally precise, but it's a useful analogy for folks. Think of a trust as a little mini corporation that we've established, and we've given property to that trust and said, hey, trust, manage this property. And we can do this while we're alive. That's called a living trust, which lots of people do, right? They'll establish a living trust, make themselves the trustee, but all the property's there. And then we have a provision in the trust that says, when I pass away, make this new person the trustee. So in a way, they're kind of functioning like an executor would for a will, but there's our successor trustee. And that trustee may have instructions to, again, kind of like a will, once old man Ferrell's passed away, transfer this property to these people and you're done. Or it might say, hey, hold on to this property until my child is 30 years old, or hold on to this for 2 more generations, et cetera, right? But our trust doesn't have to go through the probate process. It's independent of the probate process, and that's why a lot of people like it. But also, like we said earlier, it gives you the opportunity to hold assets for longer, to manage them on behalf of other people if you want to. And this lets you have more flexibility for holding onto those assets long-term versus just distributing them when someone's passed away.
Well, that's very important for the overall plan there. What would be the fifth and final step?
So the fifth step is to evaluate and revise.
Yeah.
Lots of people think that once they've done this, I'm done. And you know what? You might be, right? You may have just nailed it on the first try. But the reason, going back to earlier in our conversation, that we want to get this started as soon as possible is to have a chance to let it work for a little while. If we're talking about having a genuine business succession, right, a business transfer, we probably start taking those first steps. So at regular intervals, let's go back and see, like, hey, is this working? Or have we identified problems that we didn't know were out there and we need to fix now? As people are born or die, as people get married or divorced, and as we acquire new stuff or as we dispose of stuff, keep going back and make sure that the plan is set up in such a way that it can either absorb those changes, or if as a result of those changes, we need to amend our plans and our documents, all right, let's go back and do that. I'll give you an example from my own life. The farm kid, the kid that was coming back to the farm and ranch was my youngest brother, Adam. Mm-hmm. And Adam was killed in a farm accident in 2015. So, the Ferrell family transition plan had to undergo a major revision because the person that was going to come back and operate the farm wasn't there anymore. So that's a classic example where if we would have left our documents in place, we would have discovered a major problem down the road because it didn't take into account we had lost one of our major stakeholders.
Right.
But because we had time, we can go back and say, okay, let's make some modifications because now things have changed a whole lot. But another thing that, occasions the need for change is that laws change. Right now we have, I would argue, pretty generous estate tax exemptions at the federal level. Over $13 million for individual, or, almost $27 million for a husband and wife as of this year. But that law is set to sunset at the end of 2025. So unless Congress makes a modification to that law, starting January 1st, 2026, our estate tax exemptions will basically go back to what they were in 2017, but adjusted forward for inflation. So if that were to happen today, the numbers would be roughly 17 million and roughly 14 million, which is, still a lot. That still encompasses a lot of our farms and ranches. But for some of our farms and ranches, they've got an asset value higher than that. And so that kind of a major change in tax laws might require them to go back and really make some changes as to how they handle some of their, tax and transactional approaches to estate planning. That's why it's important to keep going back and check on this plan, make sure that it's fitting our family situation, our business situation, and the legal environment that's in place at that point in time.
That is great information, all 5 of those points. The question that I have is, I was talking with a producer one time, and he said, it's kind of heartbreaking that none of the next generation is interested in the farm. And so he said, I don't know what to do about liquidating this or setting up a plan for whenever I pass away, my wife passes away. I don't know what to do. And so what advice would you have for somebody who may be looking at a generational liquidation of all the farm assets?
This is a phenomenal question, and so I'll age myself a little bit here. So this summer, I will have been with OSU for 17 years.
Wow.
And I would say in the first 10 years of my time here, the question I always got with respect to farm transition planning was farm kid, city kid. I have one kid that wants to come back, one kid that doesn't. How do I equitably handle that? And trust me, there are plenty of complications to that situation, which make it really challenging. But I would say in the last 5 years, and especially within the last 2 years, I have increasingly gotten the question of, hey, I have no kids coming back. There is no farm kid. So what do I do? And so there are a few ways you can look at that. So I'm going to tell you that as someone who actually is an ordained minister in an actual real church, not ordained off the internet, okay, and a guy who's read the Bible cover to cover a couple of times, it is not a sin to sell farmland. You actually can do that regardless of what your dad or your granddad said, okay? And in any other business enterprise, right? Well, you're an entrepreneur in the tech sector. Your goal would be to start a business, grow its value aggressively, and the way that you would harvest that growth was that you would sell the business at the end. Any other business, we do that. But in agriculture, we've put that off limits for ourselves. I'm here to tell you, if you don't have a kid coming back to the farm, that's an option for you. You can do it, okay? Will there be capital gains taxes? Yeah, you bet, okay? But still, right, you could sell that asset and harvest its value and invest it in some other way if you wanted to. But if you're not comfortable doing that, okay, there's a couple of other approaches we could take. We could point to ourselves and say, hey, I'm the CEO of this business, but I don't have a labor force coming back. So I need to hire a labor force. So you could hire a farm operator, right? And basically pay them a salary while you retain the assets, and the returns to ownership, right, would still accrue to you. So you've made it an investment asset with yourself as the owner, but you've basically kind of outsourced your labor, if you want to think about it that way. I see that approach for lots of farm families that don't have a kid coming back to the farm. But the other approach you could use is say, okay, let's find a non-family successor. So I'm going to find somebody that wants to take over this operation because I want someone to farm it. That's important to me. So what you then need to do in that situation is you need to find somebody that you're comfortable operating with. And I refer to this as, this is in a way kind of dating and marriage for a farmer, right? You need to engage with some operators, see if you feel comfortable with them.
Right.
Maybe you start out as a share operator with them on a lease, or maybe you have them do some custom work for you. And if you like the way they operate, okay, let's kind of expand the scope of that relationship and kind of keep going and just say, you know what, I'd be comfortable with this person taking over the operation. And it doesn't mean that we have to will it to them, right? We basically give them the whole thing. But what we could say is, let's set up a transactional relationship so that you get to acquire these assets over some period of time that makes it affordable for you. We might give you a discount relative to the market value of having to accumulate all these assets all at once. But the trade-off is, hey, you don't have to go out and assemble this collection of assets. I've done it for you. You're not paying full market price for these assets. You're getting a discount. So you're getting a better deal, but I'm still getting to harvest a pretty decent chunk of the equity that I have in my operation. And then if I realize that value and put it into my estate, then I can allocate it to my heirs however I want to, because it's not tied to that farm operation anymore. So there are options out there for you. You just got to think a little bit creatively about it if you don't have a successor coming back to the farm already identified.
Let's take the opposite side of that. Say that you purchase some land, you start an operation. How important is the beginning of a succession plan in that opportunity? But from an inventory standpoint, it almost seems like there may be some advantages to that as well.
Sure. So are we talking about that from the perspective of someone that's basically started from scratch?
Right, yes.
Like someone yeah. So what I always tell, and usually if I'm talking to someone in that mode, it might be that they're a younger producer, although not always, right? According to the last census of agriculture, we have an unprecedented number of people who are starting as a farmer or rancher at age 50, 60, something like that. We might view that as a retirement job, although if you're involved with agriculture, that's not a retirement job. But it's a later in life career.
Right.
What I say, especially to young families in that regard, and let's say, hey, you're a young person, you want to be responsible, you want to have all these pieces in place, like Ferrell said earlier in the discussion. But my kids are 5 and 3. I don't feel like they've really locked in on whether or not they want to come back to the farm or ranch yet or not. I get that. So what I tell folks is just make sure that you leave doors open. Create pathways in your plan so that if someone wants to come back, you can accommodate that. And at the same time, too, keep checking in with people. I'm not saying, like I said, your 10-year-old probably doesn't know if they're coming back to the farm or not. They might at that point. But just ask. And I'm not saying you ask them every day, but every few years, check in and say, hey, do you think that in some way, someday, you might want to come back and have some sort of connection to this farm? And keep asking that question, because what I see lots of farm families do is they make an assumption about that answer and they never ask. Or they might ask once and then never revisit the question. So 1, ask. But also I would say 2, realize that there are lots of ways to be involved with the farm. I think lots of farmers and ranchers, when they're thinking about their succession plan, think of it as a complete yes or no, right? Either you're here every day on the farm as a day-to-day operator, or you're completely disconnected from it. And it doesn't have to be that way. There can be all sorts of levels of engagement with the farm. I mean, ranging from, you've got a kid with an accounting degree. Well, hey, do you want to do the bookkeeping for the farm? You have a marketing degree. Do you want to help us add, market maybe value-added products or sell direct to consumer or something like that? I mean, heaven forbid you raise a kid that's a lawyer. That kid could maybe do some contractual work and really help you kind of document things for the farm. So all that to say, hey, keep touching base with people as you move forward and leave pathways open, because the more people feel like they have some level of engagement with the farm, it makes those conversations, I think, easier, and maybe makes things even easier going forward as far as asset allocation. If people understand that, well, I'm getting a salary from the farm, so I'm getting what I've earned.
Right.
Or, is it a, heaven forbid, a sweat equity thing, which, by the way, never works, but at least that arrangement is explicit, okay, versus it being kind of tacit.
Right. Well, and the involvement of the children made me think of the Duttons on Yellowstone. So that's a prime example of how to integrate the kids into a long-term land property, correct?
Yep. And if that doesn't float your boat, you can always go watch Succession, which is entirely about what we're talking about here. And it might make it safer for you if it's in a non-ag context. It seems less threatening, right? We listen to stories in sci-fi because we're like, oh, that's those guys in the spaceship. That's not me, right? If Yellowstone seems too threatening, go watch Succession and watch it in a corporate context and see if that helps you identify things that you wouldn't see if you were watching Yellowstone.
That's next on my binge. My wife and I we go through our programs, and Succession's actually on our list, so we may have to bump that one up
in the queue.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shannon Ferrell with Oklahoma State University, for going on with us. I know this will help many folks take the generational jump from the current to the next generation as far as land ownership goes. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And of course, thank you for watching this episode of the AgNow Roundup. If there's something on the show that you'd like to learn more about, visit our website, agnowtv.com. And while you're there, you can check out this episode and past episodes. You can download the AgNow TV app. You can sign up for our social media and our email service as well. It's all available right there at agnowtv.com. Rooted in research and proven for producers. I'm Dave Deacon for AgNow.